I think this is a great conference, don't you?
Yes.
I knew I had to start with a question about how many of you like the conference and how many don't. How many are from the first part of the previous century and so on. But I personally want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this session. And I'm not putting on a coat today in order to be pretentious. It's just part of my habit every time the room temperature approaches 0. And what I like to talk about today, and I've been asked to talk about, is how we work with use coaching ourselves with the public service in Denmark. I'm especially pleased actually to present this with my colleague from Japan. It brings up in me some very warm memories from way back when I was visiting professor at the Institute for Leadership under UN in Tokyo. I think from the way the Japanese work together and how they work together with clients from overseas, from the Far East and whatnot, it's quite interesting. I'm sure you're going to enjoy Nao's presentation. I also want to say initially that I've had a very interesting experience. I went up to pick up a few things. I went up to pick up a few things at my room, and I got stuck in the elevator, all by myself. So I pushed the button and talked to a lady who said, "What can I do for you?" It was pretty easy to explain what the problem was. But she said an interesting thing in reply. She said, "Stay on the line."
Stay on the line.
So I thought, what are my alternatives? Anyway, I want to say that leadership development is, to me, one of the most important jobs for top leaders. We should never forget that people apply for jobs in your organization because of what the organization does and because of the reputation that the organization has. But you know why they leave? They leave because of poor leadership. So we're losing in our organizations a lot of good people who leave because of insufficient attention to leadership. I'll also say to you that as part of my own journey in life, I've sort of moved from being very dedicated public servant to going into private business in the consulting area, where I've been for the last 13 years. But now I feel that I'm on the move again. I'm sort of moving towards becoming a CEO missionary, coaching ourselves missionary. It's actually one of the few opportunities I can see for combining a very good mission with a reasonable income. So I love doing that kind of missionary work. But I also want to thank some of the people who are here, not least Jeanette and Marianne, who were kind enough to invite us inside of the municipality of Elsinore to help them generate better leadership because they were confronted with a very comprehensive public school reform imposed by the national government, and with very short time frames. We have been very, very lucky to get that opportunity, our first really big job. And we're also very lucky that we have worked with so many very, very good people. 14 exceptional people are here at the conference to learn more, but also to celebrate the completion of their course. We've only worked with this for 2 years when Phil asked if we would like to try to represent Coaching Ourselves in Denmark and try it out. And he didn't hide that there was another guy who had tried to use Coaching Ourselves in Denmark, but who had actually not been successful. That's no exaggeration. He has never sold one single module in Denmark, so he was truly unsuccessful. And I talked to him a little bit, having accepted, of course, to work on this great concept. And he said, you can't sell this kind of modules in Denmark. It's just not a thing that people want to buy. But then I thought about Peter Drucker, who wrote in his book, Innovation and Entrepreneurship, old book. He wrote a story, told a story about the shaving company Gillette. You remember that one of these scrapers instead of using a knife, and they tried to sell that new product by selling the machine itself at a price of $5, and then you could get 10 blades for a cent. And people didn't want to buy it. It wasn't a success at all. And then somebody came and said to him, you know what? People don't want to buy machines for $5. They want to pay for shaving. So why don't you sell the machine for 50 cents and sell 2 blades for a cent? Then you'll make your money on what is really essential in that process, namely to cut your beard instead of on machinery. And it's the same thing here. We're not selling the modules. We are actually selling leadership development coordinated with the corresponding organizational development. And the principal tool that we use is the modules created by Coaching Ourselves. The reason we do that is that is in our, certainly in my very long experience, one of the most effective and efficient tools to reach the goal. And not only that, it is also the only tool I know of that so naturally coordinate the development of individuals with the development of their organization. And then I thought, because once again today I was inspired by Jonathan when he said, talked about the importance of generating usness. I mean, that we're together responsible for our area or our organization. And actually, Coaching Ourselves does just that. My interest in leadership development actually dates back to my childhood. You wouldn't believe it, it's true. My father was the president of a private business, and he had 4 main interests in his life. His first, and I dare say most important interest, was my mother. And thanks to that particular interest, I'm able to be with you today. The second interest of his was me. The third one was our riding horses. But the one that sort of took most conversation time was his business. And within that business, how he could develop people to become more impressive. That was an expression he used. And of course, I didn't understand very much about this, but being an only child, I thought, as it is now, I'm totally excluded from that conversation, ongoing conversation between my mother and my father. So I decided to take an interest in what they were talking about. That didn't mean I got included, but I felt slightly less excluded. And one thing I remember, sometimes you remember little incidents from way back, and there's one that I remember. My father had a problem that he shared with my mother, and how she sustained her apparent interest in all that, I don't know, but she did. And he said, he was talking about deploying people, how difficult it was to make sure that the right people were put in the right spot. And my mother, who was no manager, said something that stuck with me. She said, couldn't you just ask them what they would like to do? And somehow I remember my father's facial expression. It was sort of, yeah. But I'm not going to admit to that. And it's actually funny how one could think that way. It made an impression on me. It became clear to me that you have to seek simple and clear solutions wherever it's possible. Coco Chanel said one day, simplicity is the core piece of elegance, and people like elegant solutions. Coaching Ourselves is an elegant solution to organizational and leadership development and the generation of usness. But let me just explain what we actually do and why we think that Coaching Ourselves could be useful as a tool in the rest of the public service in Denmark. Let me talk about our program. We have actually divided our program into 3 phases. Phase 1 is the training of facilitator. I think it's to be overly optimistic to believe that you just give a leader a module in his hand and that he then or she then will be able to sit down and have a really fruitful discussion. You just don't know how to do it. And one of the things That may be a characteristic of the public service, I don't know. I've never really been in the private business, but in the public service, people think that when they have understood something intellectually, they basically also have done it. And when you walk around in the real world, you realize that there is a slight difference between the two things. But it's interesting to see how people oh yeah, I understand that. And it's also interesting to see that when they're doing really well, the authors of the modules are doing really well, and say something that is people have never thought of, but when they see it, it's self-evident. I mean, it's so obvious that you actually think you knew it. And not only that, but you also had done it. And a good facilitator has to say, are you sure that you actually have thought about this before? If so, why do you get so excited about it right now? Anyway, so I think some kind of understanding of how you facilitate this thing is necessary. I also know that the first inclination might be to say, all right, then the management team will sit around the table and will hire a consultant. And it's funny, I've been a consultant for 15 years now. It's actually the longest job I've ever had. It's not a job, it's just work. But what strikes me here is that you can take a man out of the public service, but you really can't take the public service out of a man if he has been there for a long time. So I look at this and think, a consultant, $4,000 for 3 hours, on top of a minimal amount of money for the modules, doesn't make any sense. It also doesn't make any sense to me not to build capacity into your client's organization. There must be some footsteps in return for the money they pay you, quite frankly. So what we have done is that we have taken sort of the highest levels at each location in the school system and trained them extensively in facilitation. Facilitation, in our view, is more than knowing how to walk through a module. It's also how to understand better what it takes to run an excellent public service unit. To that effect, Paul and I did a study way back when, and we published a book called The 3 Pillars, it looks like this, of public management, Secret of Sustained Success, and it's actually published at the Queen's McGill University Press. We received a letter that helped us greatly in getting the book sold, I guess, from Herbert Simon, the famous Nobel Prize winner, who said he had picked up our book in an airport and actually read it, and he really liked it. And here's a blurb you can put on 2nd edition if you want to. And guess what? Funnily enough, we wanted to. So, anyway, we've taken the framework here from that book, and we're talking about that with our clients. The idea here is that we're saying to them, there are 9 elements, 3 pillars first pillar is the goals. You have to have a good vision, you have to have good values, you have to have good grip on the leadership side, appointment, training, promotions, deployment, whatever. You have to have a good grip. We're not telling you how, but just telling you that all the good, we have 40 organizations around the globe that we looked at, and they all had that in common. They had a vision that was working as part of daily life, organizational work, values that were implemented. They had thought through leadership aspects and had a good grip on that. Corresponding here, they had accountability. They had very good view of human beings. Like, they looked at human beings, not human resources. They could see the difference already in those years, back in last century. It was a delightful way they talked about their employees. It was different from other organizations. They saw their people as really unique assets to achieve what they were supposed to achieve. We had also trust as a very important cornerstone, and we had here very good communication. Well, not just one-way communication, but all over the place. Here, they had a fabulous grip on how to use teamwork. It was not just every time they had a problem, let's have a team of the old guard that have worked so well in the past. They selected specially people for the special task, and they didn't use teams unless there was a sufficient complexity in what they were doing. For instance, very sort of strictly regulated areas would not be put into team, but more creative thing. So, for instance, with Paul's and my background in prison system, we recommended strongly not to put accounting and bookkeeping into creative teams because it doesn't lead to anything good in our experience. And the two last ones are change management. They had focus on change management. They knew that the world is changing, organizations are changing with them, so we have to pay attention to how do we live and manage in a changed society. And they had a toolbox that was particularly designed to this. It's interesting that not only one organization used this down from the shelf kind of thing, like total quality management, re-engineering, like these concepts that are supposed to fit all. They didn't use them. They took bits and pieces and carefully selected them to fit together, but also fit to the kind of organization they were, the people who worked in them. Then, of course, we trained them very much in what this universe is all about, and also in how to go through the modules. The second part of it is that we took their employees and went through 10 modules, one module every 3 weeks, one afternoon every 3 weeks, 3 hours, because Danes speak twice as much as Canadians. So 3 hours is a good time for Danish managers. That's our experience. And it was very interesting because suddenly these facilitators now became real facilitators. They had to take responsibility for their employees as they went through 10 modules. And we were sort of assisting them. What happened in Elsinore, and we're recommending the same thing to other organizations, was that all the 80 leaders were invited to come to the same location at the same time. They were divided up school by school with their own facilitators and had their locally focused discussion based on the same module across the organization. It was very interesting. They worked hard in the morning. They came tired to our sessions and they left invigorated. These are their words, not ours. And another success criterion, I think, is that we had almost no absenteeism throughout these 10 years. I mean, if you think of 80 busy people and you ask them to come every 3 weeks for 3 hours, you would expect a certain amount of people, a number of people who couldn't come. We didn't have that. We've repeated it with another group of leaders from Elsinore as well, who showed exactly the same pattern. Although these leaders of daycare institutions, there were 75 of them, they didn't have a crisis. They were not under pressure. They just wanted the same as the principals of the schools because they liked it, so they wanted it too. And Marianne, who sits there, was actually great enough to say, of course, these leaders can benefit from that as well. And I don't think I've ever had a group of people over such a long time with so much fun and so much energy. It's simply a great experience for me personally. So all of that has gone well, and we've tried in other organizations as well, the Correctional Services of Denmark, the work market authorities across the land, and we are having many more in the pipeline. And 2 we have already to get started on right after New Year's. That's 2 municipalities who go through joint implementation of the new school reform, and they are following the Coaching Ourselves leadership principles. And thanks to Hans Christian and his filthy rich foundation, they are actually taking an interesting, you know what, it's an amazing thing. You know the Maersk ship line company? Yeah. Every time it seems that they had a couple of $1 million, they threw it into a family fund. And it's pretty big now, and they use that money for all kinds of purposes to the benefit of society and life. It's a fantastic. They gave the nation an opera and a ballet scene and a million other things. And when the school reform was to be implemented, the board of directors at the fund thought that they would contribute a little money. So they donated, hold on to your denture here, they donated 200 million Canadian dollars to ensure that the implementation could happen in a proper and well-funded way. It's quite fantastic. And there's a whole division being led by Hans Christian, who is now dealing with all these applications. And some of the things they're doing, they're pointing out if there are weaknesses in the leadership side of the project, and they've asked us to go in and help using the Coaching Ourselves. So we're very happy about that. So, by the way, the people that we're going to work with. That means, Phil, that we will be ordering about 1,000 modules early next year for that purpose. Anyway, I would have liked to talk about the specific project in Elsinore, but there's no time to do that. But the last phase that we are now working hard on developing is the follow-up period. How do we make sure that people don't see this as the end of it, and thank you very much, we had a good time. But what we're seeing is that a lot of the school principals are reusing the same modules, returning to them again and again, and using. What we are not seeing, and that's partly because of us, we're not seeing them continuing to use more modules. But I think that will come when the time is right for that. But we have to be a little more organized so we can keep servicing these clients. One of the big challenges is to get the leadership of these organizations involved in this. Not that I'm not enjoying talking to some of these leaders, but you know, I'm not talking about the school system here, but there are really many, let me put it this way, quite simple-minded leaders. I was talking to one. We have one of our principles in our organization is that we don't work with people we don't like, because we can't give them good service, and we tell them that this is probably better you go somewhere else. Anyway, I met some guy, and I said to him, you should be part of this with your people. Good officers train with their soldiers. That's the way they encourage them. That's the way they teach them what to do. And he said, well, I don't need to be part of that, you see, because I'm actually an economist. I thought that would count the other way, but then again, I'm biased and clearly against their way of thinking. Not that I don't like some economists. Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith, was a fabulous guy. He is a Canadian because he was born on a farm in Ontario, so he's good enough. But he was also saying interesting things about the economy. He said one day, long-term economic plans have at least one, and maybe only one, but at least one advantage. And that is that it so clearly places astrology among the exact sciences. I think that's pretty precise. But this guy said, I'm an economist, I have an MPA, I'm doing things I have a diploma in leadership. And then he said something I'll never forget, which showed his complete incompetence. And he said, and I know Mintzberg and all that, I don't really know what that means. But from there on in, I sort of agreed that he was not maybe the best candidate for us. Now, will this work for the other part of the public service in Denmark? I think so. The evolution has been an interesting thing in terms of management style and leadership style in the public service, not least in the national departments and agencies. Years ago, it was sort of a homegrown leadership style that had no real basis in any kind of theoretical thinking or evidence or anything else. But the whole system was dominated by lawyers, and you can say a lot of bad things about us, and justifiably so, but at least the idea that human beings are important and have to be respected is sort of part of our training. That's where it all starts. But there has been a shift, a clear shift towards economists leading us. They are the ones who are setting the agenda. And that means that a lot of the guys who think that the world is a spreadsheet and what is not there, it doesn't exist, kind of thing has been dominating to the detriment of the public service of Denmark. But I'm not just a born optimist. I also see signs that give cause for some optimism, because they start to see that they are not delivering. Actually, they're telling a good story, but they're not delivering. People are not happy. You know, this gray zone that nobody can define, but everybody knows that it isn't right? This is what is happening at the center of government. And we are actually talking to them and saying, don't stop your spreadsheets. I mean, what else would you be doing? But add this dimension to it. We are talking about this humanistic approach on top of what you do. And then you have a better chance to do a sober assessment of where you want to go. And there are glimmers of hope. Although the economism, as I call it, is still very predominant. But I think there's something to what Margaret Whitley, formerly previously from Harvard, says in her book. That's a very good book, by the way. That's called Leadership in the New Sciences. That's another story. But she says some systems are sort of like supernova stars. Those that shine the most just before they collapse under their own weight. So I go out every evening and see if our public service star might collapse tonight. I think it will, but I think that we are going to see an incremental movement. Anyway, I could talk a lot more about this, but I think that my time is soon up. I do want to say that my personal inclination is that incremental improvement is all right, but we are at the stage, as the two of you stated yesterday, where something dramatic has to happen if we want to come back on track. I mean, we have incrementally, albeit rather quickly, moved away from something, and we need something. My I talked to Paul about it yesterday, and we agree that organizations ought to have a chief decluttering officer with line authority to come in and say, you know what, this is nonsense. And you know, another thing, we're not going to do it anymore. The reason I think you need that is my own experience. When I took over the leadership of the Correctional Services of Canada, they had, listen to this, 200,000 pages of rules and regulations. I mean, can you imagine? I looked at it and I said, people can, when they do their best, read 20 pages of this nonsense an hour. That means 10,000 hours of work. And if you have a work week of 40 hours, it means 250 weeks. So 6 years from now, you will know what the organization is all about. But if you think that, you made a grave mistake, because at the other end, we had a policy unit of 40 people. The worst possible combination, bright, energetic, and regulation junkies. So they would simply be shoveling more regulations in every day of the year, and you would never get to a point where you knew what the hell is going on. So we just made an executive decision that we have to go down to 2,000 pages, including guidelines and forms and everything else. So that's what they did as long as it was there. But when they saw that my tenure was about to expire, they started to build up the policy unit again. I mean, this is how it is. I think that Isaac Adizes is right when he says, never forget that committed bureaucrats only like other committed bureaucrats, and nobody else gets a chance to get in through the legal and normal channel. Yeah, I also think, that's my final thing, I think that when I look at the political system here in my country, we need a new youth uprising. And I've actually sort of thought about starting one. And you know, I actually have a lot of supporters, a lot. The only problem is that there's only one who's under 70. But I hope it will happen, and I see a great future for the public service, especially if it goes hand in hand with the development of coaching ourselves. Thank you very much for your time.